That's right, it's time for another TV series characters in the Railway series style video. I've made about a dozen of these videos so far, so if you've been keeping up, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. For those of you who are new, I've provided a playlist, but the general gist is that I take a handful of characters from the TV series and illustrate them as Railway series characters, whilst reworking their backstory to get them to fit in the world of the books. With that, it's time to begin. Winston is one of those characters from the TV series who really doesn't need a lot of changing in order to fit in the Railway series lore. He's just the Fat Controller's inspection vehicle, which would make sense to exist in either continuity. Winston is even based on a design which could feasibly exist on Sodor without any ifs or buts. He's a Type 4B 2-seat Wickham trolley. Given that he is a Wickham trolley, I'm surprised they didn't get Keith Wickham to voice him. I have seen one of these inspection vehicles at the Mangaps Railway Museum, which incidentally is also home to British Railways number 11103, aka the real-life Mavis. Interestingly, a trolley with the same design and colour scheme as Winston appeared in a magazine story from 1994, nearly 20 years before Winston made his first appearance. It isn't sentient, as original vehicles from the magazine stories never were at the time. I came up with a theory about this you can hear about in my Magazine Engines video, but I can't say for certain whether or not it's true. I guess we'll only find out for certain if someone who worked on the magazines at the time speaks up about it, assuming anyone even still remembers. Winston doesn't have much of a backstory, but I suppose he doesn't really need one. It can be quite safely assumed that British Railways supplied the northwestern region with an inspection trolley at some point during the era of nationalised railways. Given that Winston's livery is more or less the same as the real-life inspection trolley he's based on, his livery is basically the same as his TV series counterpart as well. About the only difference between Railway series Winston and TV series Winston is the fact that Railway series Winston, not having a door at the front, has an embedded face. Here we see the Fat Controller driving Winston to a part of the main line where the maintenance team are repairing part of the line. And with that said, here is the completed drawing. Stephen is the first character from the Ark era that we're covering in this series, and in universe he is certainly one of the oldest. In the TV series, Stephen is literally supposed to be Stevenson's rocket. He is discovered by the Earl... the Earl of Sodor. Thank you. Anyway, he is brought to Sodor and restored to working order. However, I think things would be a bit different if this happened in the Railway series. In real life, Stevenson's rocket was preserved but never restored to working order. Instead, a replica was built. It's possible that, in the Railway series timeline, the original rocket was restored in lieu of a replica, but it doesn't seem very likely to me. Restoring the original rocket to working order would require every part to be replaced, or near enough every part, and at that point, why rebuild him when you could just use the new parts to make a replica instead? So my line of thinking is that Stephen is the original rocket, but he isn't restored and remains in 1830s condition. How does this tie in with Sodor? Well, if a replica rocket was to be made in the Railway series timeline, perhaps it would make some sense for Crovan's Gate Works to carry out some or all of the construction. The original rocket, aka Stephen, therefore, could be brought along as well, partially so that the works employees can take measurements for the replica, and he could maybe even play an advisory role, so that the people building the replica can ask him whether or not the new build captures his good side, and so on. Naturally, word gets out to the other engines that Stephenson's rocket is on Sodor, with many engines making excuses to travel to the works to get to meet him. Stephen would tell the engines about his achievements at the Rainhill trials and how much his old railway from the early 19th century differs from the railways of today. I haven't added a face to the replica Stephenson's rocket, which is consistent with how it appears in Thomas and the Great Railway Show. The replica rocket represents the engine in as-built condition and so lacks a smokebox and buffer beam. Clive Spong, who illustrated Rocket in the book, explained that he is sentient in the Railway Series timeline, but in order to preserve the technical details of the real replica, a face wasn't included. When the original rocket was modified with a smokebox, the door of the smokebox was not circular. As a result, I've given Stephen a non-circular face. As he has not been steamed in over 100 years, his face is darkened from the lack of heat. And with that, here is the finished illustration. Millie is the final character we'll be covering in this video. She was designed by de Coville and built by Borsig in the early 20th century. In the TV series, she is owned by the Earl of Sodor or the Duke of Sodor, Sir Robert Norramby, who acquired her during one of his globe-trotting adventures. She operates on his estate railway at Ulfstead Castle. It's worth noting that the Duke of Sodor is canon to the railway series, and lives at Ulfstead Castle like in the TV series. Whilst there is no mention of an estate railway at the castle in the railway series universe, it doesn't seem too far-fetched for something similar to exist. Normally I don't include TV series locations into these types of videos because eventually you get to a point where the timeline essentially just becomes the TV series timeline. But this, like the Sodor Waterworks, is an exception. Millie originally worked in France and operated at several factories before being withdrawn from service and being acquired by the Duke of Sodor for a project he was working on. The project, of course, being the estate railway. She helped build the railway and has operated the line since its opening. She enjoys her life on the estate railway much more than any of her previous jobs, as it allows her to meet new people on a frequent basis who are always happy to be there. Generally, the estate railway is open to the public between Easter and Halloween, but during the winter months Millie still has things to do, often pulling maintenance trains and sometimes even being loaned to the Skarloey Railway. The inverse sometimes happens as well. As can be expected for a line owned by the Duke of Sodor, his namesake will occasionally make trips to the estate railway during the busy season. In more recent years, 2 engines that once ran on the Mid-Sodor Railway were acquired and preserved. We know this because they appeared at last year's Awdry extravaganza at the Talaclyn Railway, those engines being Albert and Jerry. I figured that the Ulfstead Castle Estate Railway would be as good a place as any for these 2 engines to reside. As such, I've decided to draw Albert and Millie at one of the stations on the line. Albert is also French, at least in my headcanon, and so it seemed appropriate to include him in the drawing. Albert's suave demeanour often contrasts with Millie's fiery temper, which sometimes comes to the forefront if she feels as though she's being wronged. Albert often likes to think of himself as the more reasonable one, but he is often a bit pompous and full of himself, which in turn can give Millie a good opportunity to take him down a peg where appropriate. They might bicker from time to time, but they are still good friends at the end of the day. And so, here is the finished drawing. And there we are, 3 more engines from the CGI series in the style of the original books. Working these characters into the Railway series lore is always an interesting challenge to overcome, and I think these characters work well after a bit of tweaking. Heck, Winston barely needed any tweaking at all. But with that said, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you later, and I promise I'll eventually cover the logging locos, even if I can't say when.